There's shows that entertain you. And then there's shows that make you feel something deeper, something harder to name. American Restoration was that second kind of show. For 6 seasons, millions of Americans sat down every week, not just to watch television, but to watch a man pour his soul into bringing forgotten pieces of history back to life. They watched Rick Dale and his crew take objects that most people would throw away, rusty gas pumps, cracked jukeboxes, battered motorcycles, antique soda machines, and transform them into something beautiful again. It wasn't just restoration, it was resurrection. And then, without a single warning, it was gone. The show vanished. The shop went silent. Rick Dale disappeared from screens entirely, and the History Channel moved on like none of it had ever mattered. But the real story of what happened behind the cameras is far more complicated, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than most people ever realized. To understand why American Restoration ended the way it did, you have to go back to the very beginning, back before the cameras, before the celebrity clients, before the ratings records, back to when Rick Dale was just a craftsman in Las Vegas who had been fixing broken things since he was a child. Rick Dale didn't stumble into restoration. He grew up with it in his hands. As a young boy, his father pulled an old bicycle out of a neighborhood dumpster and handed it to Rick with a simple challenge: fix it. That moment planted something in him that never went away. He spent decades building up a skill set and a reputation in Las Vegas, becoming the kind of craftsman that people sought out when they had something truly special they needed saved. His shop, Rick's Restorations, became known for the quality of its work and the passion behind it. Rick wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't trying to build a brand or cultivate a following. He was just doing what he loved, the same thing he had always loved, and doing it exceptionally well. That authenticity is exactly what caught the attention of television producers, and ironically, it's exactly what television would eventually try to strip away from him. His path to the History Channel ran directly through Pawn Stars, the Las Vegas-based reality show that launched in 2009 and became a cultural sensation almost overnight. The show followed Rick Harrison and his family running a pawn shop, and whenever they needed expert opinions on antique items or restoration work, they called Rick Dale. His appearances on that show revealed something that television executives immediately recognized as rare and valuable. Rick Dale wasn't performing for the camera. He wasn't putting on a show. He was simply being himself, talking about what he knew, doing what he did, and viewers were completely captivated by it. There's a certain magnetism that comes from watching someone who is genuinely excellent at something, someone who has mastered a craft through years of real work. Rick had that quality in abundance, and the History Channel knew they had to build something around it. American Restoration premiered on October 25, 2010, and it connected with audiences on a level that surprised even the network. The show was centered around Rick's shop and the people in it, and that cast of real people is a big part of what made it work so well. Rick's wife, Kelly, managed the business side of operations with the kind of practical competence that anyone who has ever run a small business could recognize and respect. His son Tyler was a central figure in the show's emotional core, with Rick openly hoping that Tyler would eventually take over the business and carry on what he had built. Rick's brother Ron worked as a picker, hunting down items that needed saving. There was Bretley, Rick's stepson, and there was Cowboy, the shop's metal polishing specialist, a man Rick described as the grumpiest person he had ever encountered, which made him oddly endearing to viewers everywhere. These weren't characters written by a writer's room. They were real people doing real work, and that reality came through the screen every single week. At its peak, the show was drawing nearly 3 million viewers per episode and was being broadcast in more than 80 countries around the world. Celebrity clients came through the doors regularly. People like Billy Joel, Sammy Hagar, and David Copperfield bringing in items that had personal meaning to them and trusting Rick's team to restore them properly. The episode titled Pick, Pawn in Polish became historic, drawing 6.5 million viewers and setting what was at the time the highest rating the History Channel had ever recorded. The variety of projects was astonishing. One week the crew might be restoring a 1946 Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The next week they were bringing a vintage Coca-Cola machine back to its original glory. Antique gas pumps, barber chairs, slot machines, jukeboxes, NASA helmets. The shop took on everything, and every project came with its own set of technical puzzles and historical context that made watching genuinely educational. But success in television rarely comes without a price, and the price American Restoration was asked to pay was its soul. The show was produced by Left Field Pictures, the same production company responsible for Pawn Stars, and they brought with them a production philosophy that prioritized drama over authenticity, conflict over craftsmanship, and entertainment value over the honest portrayal of real work. In the early seasons, this tension was manageable. The show still featured detailed looks at the restoration process. Viewers learned things. They understood what was involved in bringing decades-old machinery back to life. There was conflict sometimes, because real work involves real problems, but it felt organic. It felt earned. As the seasons progressed, however, the manufactured elements became harder and harder to ignore. The scripting crept in gradually, the way these things always do. Conversations with customers that seemed slightly too polished. Deadlines that seemed impossibly tight. Situations that felt designed to generate stress rather than reflecting the actual rhythms of restoration work. Fans who watched carefully started noticing things that didn't add up. Customers would be filmed arriving at the shop and filmed again receiving the finished piece, and the two moments didn't always feel connected in the natural way they should have been. The seams of production were showing. One particularly glaring incident involved Rick's brother, Ron, appearing on Pawn Stars, acting as though he had no connection to Rick, behaving like a stranger, convincing the pawn shop crew to get a Coca-Cola machine restored, when every viewer of American Restoration knew perfectly well that Ron worked at Rick's Restorations. It was a cross-promotional stunt that felt cynical and cheap, and it broke something in the relationship between the show and its audience. Even more troubling was what producers were doing to the actual business behind the scenes. Rick no longer had control over which customers came through his doors. Producers selected the clients and negotiated the terms. The show covered the cost of restorations, which meant Rick wasn't actually getting paid for the restoration work his shop performed. The financial arrangement gave him and his crew a television salary, and that salary was significant, but it came at the cost of his autonomy. Every decision about what to restore, how quickly to do it, who to feature, what drama to emphasize, all of it was being made by people whose primary expertise was in making compelling television, not in restoring vintage Americana. Rick Dale had spent decades building a reputation on the quality of his work and the honesty of his craftsmanship, and now he was essentially an actor in someone else's story about his own life. The technical criticisms from people who actually worked in restoration were particularly stinging. Professional restorers watching the show began pointing out that corners were being cut in ways that didn't reflect good practice. Items were being repainted in colors that weren't historically accurate. Fonts and design details on restored pieces weren't matching what the original items would have looked like. The craftsmanship that had made Rick's reputation was being compromised by the demands of television production, which needed things done faster and needed them to look a certain way on camera, regardless of historical accuracy. For a man who had devoted his entire working life to doing things right, this must have been an almost unbearable thing to witness happening to his own work. As the seasons wore on, the show drifted further and further from what had made it special. Viewers who had fallen in love with American Restoration because of its focus on craftsmanship found themselves watching something that looked more like a family sitcom with occasional restoration scenes. The personal storylines multiplied. The interpersonal conflicts increased. The careful, detailed examination of how restoration actually worked, the thing that had originally set the show apart from every other reality program on cable, was being squeezed out to make room for drama that felt hollow because everyone watching knew it was manufactured. Online forums filled with complaints. Longtime fans wrote about tuning out, about feeling like the show had abandoned them and abandoned its own identity. The ratings didn't collapse immediately, because audiences are often loyal beyond what a show deserves, but the enthusiasm that had driven 6.5 million people to watch a single episode was clearly fading. Rick Dale faced a situation that many skilled craftspeople thrust into the spotlight eventually encounter. He had been celebrated for his authenticity, for being genuinely himself, and then the machinery of television had slowly worked to replace that genuine self with a more marketable, more dramatic, more controllable version. He could see what was happening. He could feel it in the daily operations of his shop, in the conversations he was told to have, in the deadlines he was asked to meet, in the customers he was no longer free to choose. When the History Channel came to him about a seventh season, Rick Dale said no. He walked away from a contract that, by any reasonable estimate, represented an income well into the seven figures annually. He walked away from the fame and the celebrity clients and the guaranteed platform that millions of television craftspeople would have traded almost anything to have. He walked away because the cost of staying had become too high. What made his departure even more striking was how he handled it publicly. Rick posted a video online addressing his fans directly, thanking them for their support and encouraging them to let the network know how they felt about what had happened. The video showed a man who was clearly emotional, someone who had not made this decision lightly, someone who understood exactly what he was giving up and had decided that it was still worth giving up. There was no performance in that video. There was no spin. It was the same authenticity that had made audiences fall in love with him in the first place, and it stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly manufactured product that American Restoration had become by the time he left it. The History Channel's response revealed a great deal about how they viewed the show and the man at its center. Rather than attempting to address Rick's concerns or find some middle ground that might keep him involved, the network simply moved forward without him. They announced a complete reboot of American Restoration for its seventh season, restructuring the entire show around 5 different restoration shops scattered across the country. It was an extraordinary gamble, built on the assumption that the audience had been tuning in for the concept of restoration generally rather than for Rick Dale specifically. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Season 7 premiered on January 1st, 2016, and the response from the audience was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The new format featured 5 different shop owners, each with their own location and their own projects, with the show jumping between them across each episode. There was no continuity. There was no emotional center. There was no character that viewers had spent 6 years watching grow and change. The family dynamic that had given American Restoration its warmth was completely absent, replaced by a rotating cast of strangers that audiences had no investment in and no reason to care about. The variety that had been one of the original show's greatest strengths was also gone. The new format focused heavily on vehicle restoration, which was a strange choice given that the History Channel already had Counting Cars, filling that exact niche. The eclectic range of projects, the soda machines and barber chairs and gas pumps and slot machines, was replaced by a much narrower focus that made the new show feel redundant. Viewers who tuned in hoping to find something worth holding on to in the 7th season largely came away disappointed. Forum discussions from the time capture the sense of genuine loss that fans were experiencing, a feeling that something real and valuable had been replaced by something generic and hollow. The show had spent 6 seasons building up a store of goodwill and emotional investment with its audience, and the reboot spent that entire store in a matter of weeks. The ratings told the story more clearly than any review could. By April of 2016, just 3 months after its 7th season premiere, American Restoration was canceled. A show that had set records and reached audiences in nearly 90 countries around the world ended not with any kind of graceful farewell, but with a quiet cancellation that barely registered as news. The story of what happened to Rick Dale and his crew after the show ended is in some ways more interesting than the story of the show itself, because it reveals what these people were actually like when the cameras were gone and the producers were no longer making decisions for them. Rick himself made a significant pivot, moving away from the large-scale restoration work that had defined his television career and toward other projects. His wife, Kelly, became a licensed realtor, leveraging the name recognition from the show to build a successful career in an entirely different field. Tyler, who had been presented on the show as Rick's heir apparent in the restoration business, developed his skills in woodworking, welding, and metalwork, and built a life in Las Vegas. Though the family restoration business he was supposed to inherit never fully materialized in the way the show had suggested it might. Perhaps the most entrepreneurially successful post-show story belongs to Brett Lee, Rick's stepson, who took his sandblasting expertise and built a legitimate and apparently thriving independent business called Clean Works Mobile Media Blasting, operating multiple rigs, and working without the support of a television platform behind him. That success is meaningful because it represents exactly what the show always claimed to be celebrating: skilled craftspeople building something real through the quality of their work. Ron Dale, Rick's brother, retreated almost entirely from public life, building custom bicycles and staying out of the spotlight. Cowboy, the grumpy metal polishing expert, who had been one of the show's most beloved figures, similarly disappeared from public view after American Restoration ended. Rick himself never fully stopped doing the work he loved. He launched a website offering training and a membership community for people interested in restoration. He posted videos of himself working on vintage items, reconnecting with the audience that had followed him for years. He wrote a book about classic soda machines. He described himself as still consulting, still doing metal art on a smaller scale, still engaged with the world of vintage items that had always fascinated him.